Malcolm Gladwell revisits tipping points to explore their darker side.
Yeah.
In his newest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of the Social Engineering. I'm Andrew, and joining me today is Stephanie.
Hi, Andrew.
She's going to help us unpack all the cool insights from this book.
Glad to be here.
So for those of you who haven't read The Tipping Point,
Right.
which Gladwell wrote like 25 years ago,
Yeah.
he's kind of a big deal in the world of like social trends and stuff.
He is.
He's known for explaining how small things can cause massive changes.
Yeah, he has a real knack for making complex ideas easy to understand.
Exactly.
Which is why his books are so popular.
Totally.
Yeah.
So in this new book, he's revisiting the idea of tipping points, but looking at them through a different lens.
Yeah.
Kind of like what happens when they go wrong.
Yeah.
Or are used for bad stuff.
Exactly. He's exploring the potential for misuse.
Okay.
And the unexpected consequences that can arise.
Okay.
Even when people have good intentions.
That's a little creepy, but also super interesting.
It is.
So where do we start with this whole revenge thing?
Well, right off the bat, in his author's note, Gladwell talks about how his own thinking on tipping points has evolved over the years. He realized that he didn't fully grasp the potential for tipping point to be manipulated or to have these unintended negative consequences.
So like he's admitting he missed some stuff the first time around.
Yeah.
That's pretty humble for a famous author.
It is, and it shows that he's willing to challenge his own assumptions, which is always a good sign.
Totally.
Well, in one of the early parts of the book, he talks about what he calls the passive voice.
Okay.
And he uses this example of a politician and a witness testifying before Congress.
Okay.
It's a little complex, but it basically boils down to how people try to avoid taking responsibility.
Ooh, I hate it when people do that.
Right.
Like just own up to your mistakes, right?
Right. And Gladwell argues that this tendency to dodge blame, especially when dealing with stuff like epidemics, can actually make the problem worse.
So it's like passing the buck can lead to a tipping point in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so what's next?
Chapter 1.
What's that?
And this is where it gets juicy.
Okay.
Gladwell takes us back to the early 90s in Los Angeles,
Okay.
when bank robberies were going through the roof.
Hold up. Wasn't that the time of like Point Break and all those surfer bank robbers?
Not quite, although that movie did come out around the same time.
Okay.
Gladwell focuses on these two guys,
Okay.
Casper and Sea-Dog.
Casper and Sea-Dog. Okay.
They basically changed the game when it came to bank robberies.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So before these guys came along, most bank robbers in LA were small-time. They'd just click a note to the teller, like you said, and hope for the best.
Right.
But Casper and Sea-Dog, they were inspired by guys like Willie Sutton,
Oh, yeah.
this legendary bank robber who was known for like meticulously planning his heists.
Wasn't Sutton the one who said he robbed banks because that's where the money is?
That's him.
Okay.
And that quote, it's actually called Sutton's Law.
Right.
And doctors even use it to figure out the most likely diagnosis.
Interesting.
But anyway, Casper and Sea-Dog, they took Sutton's Law to a whole new level. A seriously messed up level.
What do they do?
They realized that the riskiest part of a bank robbery is actually going inside the bank.
Oh, so they like wore disguises or something?
Nope. They hired other people to do the robbing for them.
What?
They became like these criminal masterminds, choosing the targets, training the crews, even getting stolen getaway cars.
Whoa, so they basically created their own mini crime syndicate.
Exactly. And this like flipped the script on bank robberies in LA.
Wow.
Suddenly they became more organized and way more violent.
That's crazy.
Gladwell uses this story to show how a small change, like two guys getting a crazy idea, can have a massive impact and create a whole new wave of crime.
Okay, that's pretty wild. It's like a domino effect, right?
It is.
So what does Gladwell explore next?
Chapter 2 takes us to Miami.
Okay.
Specifically, the mystery of why Miami has such a crazy high rate of Medicare fraud.
Wait, Medicare fraud, like old people's health care?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound as exciting as bank robberies.
Trust me, it gets interesting.
Okay.
Gladwell starts by talking about this researcher named John Wenberg, who noticed that the way doctors practice medicine can vary wildly from one place to another, even if those places are really close to each other.
So like doctors in one town might do a certain procedure way more often than doctors in the next town over.
Exactly. And he found this really striking example in Vermont, where the rates of tonsillectomies, that's when they take out your tonsils, were totally different in neighboring towns. It was kind of bizarre.
Okay, so what's the deal with Miami and Medicare fraud?
Well, Gladwell found that Miami was spending way more on Medicare than other cities in Florida.
Okay.
Especially for things like wheelchairs and walkers, durable medical equipment.
Okay.
We're talking like 6 times the amount of other cities.
Whoa, so Miami is like the capital of Medicare fraud.
Pretty much.
But why?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Gladwell explores a few different theories.
Okay.
But the one he finds most compelling is the idea that Miami has a unique overstory.
Okay.
That's like the historical events and cultural norms that shape a place.
Mm-hmm.
And he suggests that this overstory combined with a few key events in 1980.
Hold on, 1980, what happened then?
Well, according to Gladwell, 3 major things happened that year that totally changed the vibe in Miami.
Right.
First, there was this massive influx of drug money from the cocaine trade.
Oh, wow, like suitcases full of cash?
Totally.
Real estate deals happening in all cash?
Works.
Like Miami Vice levels of drug money?
Totally. And all that dirty money, it basically corrupted a lot of institutions.
Right.
And created this culture where breaking the rules became normal. Then on top of that, Miami had a major race riot after some police officers were acquitted in the death of a black man.
So you had this mix of like corruption and social unrest.
Exactly. And the third thing that happened was that a lot of white residents started moving out of Miami to places like Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
So you had this big demographic shift happening too.
Wow, that's a lot of change all at once.
It is.
So Gladwell is saying that this perfect storm of events in 1980 basically set the stage for the Medicare fraud explosion.
That's what he suggests.
Wow.
He thinks that this overstory of corruption and instability made it easier for people to justify doing shady stuff.
Right.
Like defrauding Medicare, because everyone was already looking for an angle.
Man, that's messed up.
Yeah.
Okay. I need a minute to process all of it.
No worries. We'll get into more of the specifics next.
Sounds good. Stay tuned, everyone, because this story is about to get even wilder. We were talking about how Miami became a hotbed for Medicare fraud, and it's kind of blowing my mind.
It is a pretty wild story, and Gladwell really gets into the nitty-gritty of it, talking to people who were actually involved in these schemes.
Like who?
Well, he talks to these 2 brothers,
Okay.
the Delgado brothers, who were part of this massive fraud ring run by this guy named Philip Esformes.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember hearing about him. Didn't he get in big trouble?
Big time. He was convicted, but then, get this, Trump commuted his sentence.
Seriously, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the Delgados. What did they do?
Well, they were basically the guys on the ground recruiting patients, sometimes even homeless people, and bribing doctors to write phony prescriptions.
Oh, wow.
They'd bill Medicare for services that never actually happened.
So like they were gaming the system big time.
Totally. And they were super slick about it. They had all these shell companies and were laundering money with the help of drug dealers. It was like a whole underworld operation.
Man, that's intense. It's like something out of a movie.
It is. Gladwell even describes visiting this building in Miami that's supposed to be full of medical offices, but when they go inside, most of the offices are just tiny empty rooms with one person sitting at a desk.
So they were just fake offices set up to look legit? That's insane.
Exactly. They were just for show, no actual health care happening there. Gladwell uses these stories to show how widespread and blatant the fraud was in Miami. It really paints a vivid picture.
Okay, so we've got these crazy bank robbers in L.A., and now this whole Medicare fraud thing in Miami. What's next on Gladwell's tour of tipping points gone wrong?
Well, in Chapter 3, things take a darker turn. Gladwell takes us to this seemingly perfect town called Poplar Grove.
Okay.
It's got everything, beautiful homes, great schools, a strong community, but underneath all that perfection, there's a hidden crisis: teen suicide.
Whoa, that's heavy teen suicide in a picture-perfect town. That doesn't make sense.
Right. It's really puzzling because on the surface, Poplar Grove seems like the ideal place to raise kids, but Gladwell starts to dig deeper, and he compares Poplar Grove to this other town nearby called Ansdale. Ansdale is a nice town too, but it's more diverse, and there's less pressure on the kids to be like superstars.
So Poplar Grove is like the pressure cooker of towns.
Exactly. And Gladwell points out that this intense pressure to achieve, to get perfect grades, excel in sports, get into the best colleges, it can create this toxic environment for teenagers. Like the expectations are just too high.
I can see how that would be tough.
Yeah.
Like they can't just be kids and enjoy life.
Right. And Gladwell actually compares the situation to something that happened in zoos a while back in the 80s. Zoos were having a really hard time breeding cheetahs in captivity.
Cheetahs, what do cheetahs have to do with teenagers in Poplar Grove?
Well, at first everyone thought the cheetahs weren't breeding because they were stressed out being in cages, but then scientists discovered that the real problem was that cheetahs have really low genetic diversity.
Low genetic diversity? What's that?
It means that all cheetahs are very similar genetically, almost like clones of each other, and this lack of diversity made them super vulnerable to diseases.
So like if one cheetah got sick, they all got sick.
Exactly, and Gladwell uses this cheetah example to explain what he sees happening in Poplar Grove. He says that Poplar Grove's focus on conformity, on everyone being the same kind of high achiever, created a kind of social monoculture like the cheetahs.
So everyone's under pressure to fit into this one mold, and that makes them fragile in a way. That's a pretty interesting analogy.
It is, and Gladwell talks to parents and teachers in Poplar Grove who confirm this intense pressure. One parent even says they were apoplectic when their kid got a B in middle school.
Seriously, over a B, some people need to chill out.
Right, and even the principal of the high school admits that the parents are out of their fracking mind when it comes to pressure.
Wow, so Gladwell is basically saying that diversity, whether it's genetic or social, can make a community stronger and more resilient.
Exactly, and he argues that this applies not just to towns, but to all sorts of groups and organizations.
Okay, so we've gone from bank robbers to Medicare fraud to teen suicide. Where does Gladwell take us next?
Well, in Chapter 4, he dives into this idea of social engineering, how people can intentionally manipulate tipping points to achieve certain outcomes. And he starts by talking about the work of the sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kanter, who studied how the size of different groups within a larger population can affect behavior.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about a company where there's only one woman on the executive team. Kanter found that when minority groups are really small, like below a certain threshold, they often face unique challenges and pressures.
So like that woman on the executive team, she's always going to be seen as the woman and not just as another executive.
Exactly, and that can be really tough. They feel like they're under a microscope, constantly being judged and stereotyped. It can be isolating and lead to self-doubt.
I can see how that would be hard. It's like they can't just be themselves. They always have to represent their entire group.
Right, and Kanter called this being a token member of a group, and she came up with this term, the magic third, to describe the point at which a minority group starts to feel more comfortable and have more influence.
So like once you hit a certain percentage, things start to change.
Exactly, and Gladwell uses examples like Ursula Burns, the first Black woman to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of PepsiCo, to show how tough it can be to be a token even when you're super successful.
Okay, but how does all this tie back to tipping points?
Well, Gladwell suggests that if you understand this concept of group proportions, you can actually manipulate them to create tipping points.
Whoa, so like if you want a certain idea to spread, you can try to increase the number of people who support it until it reaches a critical mass.
Exactly. It's kind of like social engineering. And Gladwell gives the example of efforts to integrate housing in the 1950s. People were really worried about white flight. The idea that if too many Black families moved into a white neighborhood, all the white families would leave.
So they were trying to figure out how to integrate neighborhoods without causing a mass exodus.
Right. They were trying to find that tipping point where integration could happen without totally destabilizing the community.
That's fascinating. So it's like these ideas about tipping points were being applied to real-world social problems back then.
Exactly. And Gladwell uses this historical example to show how the concept of tipping points has been around for a while, even if people weren't always aware of it.
Great. This is getting really interesting. So where do we go from here?
Well, in Chapter 5, Gladwell takes us to Harvard, specifically the Harvard women's rugby team.
Wait, Harvard has a women's rugby team? I had no idea.
They do, and Gladwell uses this seemingly random sports team to talk about a much bigger issue, how elite colleges like Harvard try to control the makeup of their student body.
Okay, this sounds juicy. Tell me more.
So Gladwell points out that Harvard already has tons of varsity sports for women, more than any other college in the country.
So why add another one, especially a sport like rugby, which isn't that popular in the U.S.?
That's exactly Gladwell's point. He thinks that the women's rugby team serves a very specific purpose for Harvard's admissions process.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Gladwell explains that Harvard, like a lot of elite schools, has this two-track admission system. There's the regular track for, normal applicants, and then there's this other track for what they call ALDC's athletes, legacies, kids of alumni dean's interest list, kids of rich donors, and children of faculty.
So like if your parents went to Harvard or gave them a bunch of money, you have a better shot at getting in.
Pretty much, and Gladwell points out that this ALDC system gives Harvard a way to favor certain groups of students.
And he's saying that the women's rugby team is part of this somehow?
Yes, because women's rugby isn't a big sport in the U.S. Harvard has to recruit players internationally.
So they're bringing in students from all over the world.
Right. And Gladwell suggests that this is a sneaky way for Harvard to increase the diversity of their student body, at least on paper, without really changing the proportion of Asian American students they admit.
Wait, why Asian American students specifically?
Gladwell points to this lawsuit that was filed against Harvard by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. They claimed that Harvard was discriminating against Asian American applicants.
So it's like Harvard is trying to walk this tightrope of appearing diverse while still maintaining certain racial balances.
That's the implication, and the women's rugby team is just one example of how they might be doing it. Gladwell uses this case to show how colleges can manipulate group proportions to achieve their desired outcomes.
Wow. That's pretty messed up.
Yes.
It's like they're playing a game with people's lives.
It is, and it shows how this concept of tipping points can be used in really subtle and sometimes unethical ways.
Okay, my brain is still buzzing from all that stuff about Harvard and social engineering.
It's a lot to take in, right? But Gladwell isn't done yet.
Oh, no?
He's got even more mind-blowing insights to share.
Okay, so what's next on our tipping point adventure? All right, let's dive into Mr. Index and the Marriott outbreak, shall we?
Sounds good to me.
This chapter from Revenge of the Tipping Point really gets into this whole idea of superspreaders and how they can impact, how they impact outbreaks like we saw with COVID.
It does, and it uses a very specific event to illustrate the point.
Right. The Biogen Conference at the Marriott Long Wharf Hotel in Boston, February 2020. Nobody really knew what they were dealing with COVID.
It's early days.
Early days, for sure. And then, boom, you have this massive outbreak linked to the conference.
And that's where Mr. Index comes in.
Mr. Index, this guy's like, what, the poster child for super spreaders?
In a way, yes. Scientists analyzing the spread of the virus noticed that one individual seemed to be exceptionally infectious. They nicknamed him Mr. Index.
Okay, so was he just like walking around coughing on everyone? What made him so different?
Well, that's what makes this chapter so fascinating. Gladwell walks us through the research showing that some people just naturally emit far more virus particles than others.
Really? Even if they're like taking the same precautions, washing their hands, all that?
It seems that way. It's like their biology makes them more efficient at spreading the virus.
So it's not just bad luck to be near this guy. It's like extra bad luck.
Exactly. And the Biogen Conference, with so many people in close quarters, created the perfect environment for someone like Mr. Index to supercharge the spread.
Wow. Okay, so we had these hints that some people were better at spreading viruses. But we didn't really connect the dots until COVID, huh?
That's right. I mean, researchers had noticed similar patterns in past outbreaks, like with measles, for example.
Measles, yeah. I remember learning about that.
There were cases where a single individual seemed responsible for a disproportionate number of infections. But for a long time, these cases were viewed as outliers, not the norm.
So COVID really brought the whole super spreader phenomenon into focus, huh?
Absolutely. It was impossible to ignore given the scale of the pandemic.
It makes you wonder, how many outbreaks throughout history might have been driven by, a handful of these super spreaders?
A very interesting question. And it raises important questions about how we approach public health.
Like what? What kind of questions?
Well, what if we could identify these individuals early on? Could we intervene somehow?
Yeah.
Maybe prevent those huge outbreaks from happening in the first place?
Okay, now we're getting into some sci-fi territory. But seriously, is there any way to test for this? Like, can you just walk into a doctor's office and be like, hey, am I a super spreader?
I wish it were that simple, unfortunately. There's no reliable test for identifying super spreaders, not at this point anyway. But researchers are working on it, trying to understand the mechanisms involved.
It seems like there would be some ethical dilemmas too, right? Like, yeah. What do you do with that information if you could identify someone? Quarantine them. Tell everyone they know.
Absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about privacy, about individual rights versus the responsibility to protect public health.
Tricky stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Gladwell also talks about these aerosolists.
Yes.
What are they, like air quality experts? Like the folks who tell you to stay inside when there's a lot of smog?
Not exactly. Aerosolists are scientists who study how tiny particles, like viruses, travel through the air.
Oh, okay. So are we talking coughs and sneezes? Like the bigger the sneeze, the more virus you spread?
Well, that's certainly part of it, but aerosolists argue that even just breathing, even talking, can release tiny droplets that carry viruses. And for reasons we don't fully understand yet, it seems some people produce way more of these droplets than others.
So even if you're being careful, not coughing on anyone, you could still be a walking virus factory just by talking.
Essentially, yes.
Wild. So back to the Biogen conference and Mr. Index. What exactly made that event such a breeding ground for a super spreader event?
Well, remember, this was February 2020.
Right. Nobody was masking yet or anything.
Exactly. No masks, no social distancing. And this conference involved a lot of people from all over, packed into a hotel conference room.
Lots of close contact, probably shaking hands, hugging.
Right. The ideal environment for a virus to spread. And then, of course, you add someone like Mr. Index into that mix, someone who is unknowingly emitting a high volume of virus particles.
A recipe for a disaster.
It was, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. The conference became a major super spreader event.
It makes you think twice about going to those big conferences, huh? Just giant petri dishes.
Well, maybe not quite that bad, but it does highlight how quickly a virus can spread under the right conditions.
So what happened after the Biogen conference? Did they figure out how far the virus actually spread from that one event?
It's difficult to track precisely, but Gladwell describes how attendees traveled back to their homes, spreading the virus to other cities and states.
It's like that scene in Contagion, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The one where they show how the virus travels around the world.
Exactly. It really illustrated how interconnected we are and how quickly a localized outbreak can become a global problem.
Yeah, sobering, for sure. I mean, it's kind of scary to think that one event with one super spreader could have such a massive ripple effect.
It is, but it also emphasizes the importance of scientific investigation. By tracing the spread of the virus, researchers were able to understand what happened at the Biogen conference and learn about how super spreading works.
Which hopefully will help us prevent these kinds of outbreaks in the future, right?
Hopefully, yes.
Gladwell also contrasts the response to the Biogen conference with the reaction to the first known COVID case in Boston.
Oh, yes. He talks about that student, the one who traveled from Wuhan.
The one who didn't end up infecting anyone else.
That's right. And Gladwell suggests that this might be because the student just wasn't a super spreader.
So it was just pure luck that the first person to bring COVID to Boston wasn't someone shedding a ton of virus.
It does seem that way. It makes you realize how much of this depends on pure chance.
Who gets infected first, whether they're a super spreader, the environment they're in? Crazy. It makes those outbreaks seem so unpredictable.
They are, to a certain extent. But understanding the role of super spreaders can help us make those outbreaks a little less random.
Makes sense. I mean, this whole conversation is making me think about those people you know who always seem to get everyone around them sick.
I know what you mean.
Maybe they're just super spreaders, huh?
It's possible. And it raises a really interesting question for public health in the future. If we could identify these individuals, how could we intervene ethically? How could we balance individual rights with the need to protect public health?
Tough question. I don't envy the folks who have to figure that out. But I guess these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having, right? Especially after everything we've been through with COVID.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Well, in Chapter 7, Gladwell takes us in a completely different direction.
Okay.
It's called the LA Survivors Club, and it explores how we remember the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, wow, that's a huge shift from what we've been talking about.
It is, and Gladwell starts by introducing us to some Holocaust survivors who lived in Los Angeles.
Right.
People like Fred Diamond and Siegfried Hallbreich, who went through unimaginable horrors in concentration camps.
That's so heartbreaking.
It is, and these survivors, they were determined to make sure the world never forgot what happened.
Right.
They were the driving force behind creating the first Holocaust museum in the U.S. back in 1961.
Okay.
Right there in L.A.
The Martyrs Memorial Museum, which later became the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust.
Exactly. And Gladwell talks about how it took a long time for Holocaust museums to become common in the U.S.
Right.
It wasn't until decades after World War II that they started popping up everywhere.
So why the delay? Why didn't people want to talk about the Holocaust right away?
Gladwell suggests a few reasons.
Okay.
For one, a lot of survivors found it too painful to relive those experiences.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
And there was also a worry that focusing on Jewish suffering would just reinforce negative stereotypes.
Right.
Like they didn't want to be seen as weak or victims.
So there was this desire to move on and show strength.
Exactly. And Gladwell points out that even the language people used to describe the Holocaust evolved over time. It went from being called things like Nazi atrocities miniseries to the more all-encompassing term Holocaust.
So the way we talk about it changed, and so did the way we remember it.
Exactly. And Gladwell argues that a major turning point in all this was the airing of a TV miniseries called Holocaust back in 1978.
I've heard of that. Wasn't it a big deal?
Huge. Millions of people watched it, and it sparked a lot of conversation and debate.
Wow.
Gladwell says that this miniseries, even though it wasn't perfect, had a huge impact on how people understood the Holocaust.
Okay.
It made it more real and relatable for people who hadn't lived through it.
It's crazy to think that a TV show could have such a profound effect on how we remember history.
I know, right? It just shows you the power of storytelling. And Gladwell even points out that the miniseries influenced the way Holocaust museums were named.
Oh, really?
After it aired, a lot of them started using the word Holocaust in their names.
So a TV show helped reshape our collective memory of one of the most horrific events in history. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and it sets the stage for Gladwell's next chapter, which explores another example of how popular culture can subtly shift attitudes and norms.
Chapter 8, Doing Time on Maple Drive. What's this one about?
This chapter focuses on the portrayal of gay characters in TV and movies.
Okay.
And how those portrayals have changed over time, reflecting shifting attitudes towards homosexuality in society.
Okay, interesting. Walk me through this.
Gladwell starts by dissecting a scene from this TV movie from 1992 called Doing Time on Maple Drive.
Okay.
It's about this young guy who's struggling with his sexuality.
So this movie represents how gay people were often depicted back then.
Exactly. Gladwell points out that the movie relies on a lot of common stereotypes about gay characters.
Okay. They're often shown as isolated, troubled, and their stories often end tragically.
Not exactly a positive representation?
Not at all. And Gladwell contrasts this with a much later sitcom.
Okay.
Will and Grace, which premiered in 1998.
Okay.
This show was groundbreaking for its portrayal of a gay man and his straight female best friend.
I loved Will and Grace. It was hilarious.
It was. And even though it wasn't explicitly political,
right,
Gladwell argues that it played a huge role in making gay relationships more normal and accepted for mainstream audiences.
It showed that gay people could be funny, successful, and have loving relationships just like anyone else.
Exactly. And Gladwell says that the creators of the show weren't trying to make a big statement or push an agenda.
Right.
They just wanted to make a funny show with relatable characters.
But by doing that, they accidentally helped change people's minds about homosexuality. It's like they snuck in a message of acceptance through humor. That's a great way to put it. And Gladwell even quotes this conservative politician, Rick Santorum, who admitted that Will and Grace had influenced public opinion on gay marriage.
Wow. That's a pretty big admission coming from a conservative politician.
It is, and it just shows how powerful popular culture can be in shaping our attitudes and beliefs, even when it's not trying to.
Right. Okay, so we've covered Overstories, Superspreaders, and group proportions. We've talked about bank robberies, Medicare fraud, teen suicide, the Holocaust, and even Will and Grace. Where does Gladwell go from here?
Well, in his final chapter, Gladwell brings all these ideas together to analyze the opioid epidemic.
Oof, that's a heavy one.
It is. And Gladwell starts by taking us back to the 1930s and this guy named Paul E. Madden.
Okay.
He was a drug enforcement official in California who was obsessed with controlling opioid use.
So this is where the idea of triplicate prescription pads comes from.
Know this. Madden was convinced that the only way to prevent opioid addiction was to make it really hard for doctors to prescribe them. So he pushed for a law that required doctors to make 3 copies of every opioid prescription. They wrote one for the patient, one for the pharmacy, and one for the government.
Wow, that seems like a lot of paperwork.
It was, but Gladwell argues that this seemingly bureaucratic measure actually had a profound impact on how people in California viewed opioids.
Interesting.
It created a culture of caution and made people think twice before prescribing or taking them.
So it changed the overstory around opioids in California.
Exactly, and this overstory persisted for decades, even after Madden was gone.
Wow.
And Gladwell thinks it's one of the reasons why California was spared from the worst of the opioid crisis in the 1990s.
So their unique overstory acted as a kind of shield against the epidemic. That's fascinating.
It is, but Gladwell also points out that Purdue Pharma, the company that made OxyContin, knew all about these triplicate prescription laws.
Oh.
And guess what they did?
They just avoided those states altogether.
Exactly. They focused their marketing efforts on states that didn't have these laws, where doctors were more likely to prescribe opioids freely, and they even hired a consulting firm, McKinsey & Company, to help them identify doctors who were already prescribing a lot of opioids, what Gladwell calls superspreader doctors.
So they were targeting the doctors who were most likely to overprescribe. That's so cynical.
It is, but it was also incredibly effective by focusing on these super spreader doctors. Purdue Pharma was able to dramatically increase OxyContin sales.
So they used their understanding of tipping points to fuel the opioid epidemic. It's like a twisted marketing strategy.
It is, and it shows how these concepts can be used for both good and evil. And finally, Gladwell describes the third act of the opioid crisis, the unintended consequences of Purdue Pharma's decision to reformulate OxyContin in 2010.
They made it harder to crush and snort.
Right. They were trying to make it harder to abuse, but it totally backfired. Gladwell explains that this reformulation actually drove a lot of addicts to even more dangerous drugs, like heroin and fentanyl.
So their attempt to fix the problem just made it worse.
Exactly, and Gladwell uses this example to illustrate how even well-intentioned efforts to control an epidemic can have unintended consequences, especially if those efforts are based on a flawed understanding of how tipping points really work.
Man, that's a lot to unpack. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What does Gladwell want us to learn from all these stories?
I think his main point is that we need to be more aware of the overstories that shape our world and the potential for tipping points to emerge both for good and for bad.
So, like, we need to be more critical thinkers and not just accept things at face value.
Exactly. And we need to be mindful of how our own actions, even small ones, can contribute to the spread of ideas and behaviors, both positive and negative.
It's a call to action, to be more conscious of the forces at play in our lives and to use our understanding of tipping points to make the world a better place.
I think that's a great way to sum it up.
Well, thanks for guiding me through this wild ride, Stephanie. I feel like I've learned so much about tipping points and how they shape our world.
It was my pleasure. Andrew, always happy to dive into a good book.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Superspreaders, and the rise of the social engineering.
Until next time, stay curious.